"Put that flag down or I'm calling the police." "It's my dad's flag, ma'am." "Not anymore. This is a private community." "Yeah, that actually happened." One second, I'm just hanging an American flag on our porch. The next, our self-appointed HOA General Karen herself is torching my father's memorial flag on our lawn. Hit like if you've ever dealt with a neighbor who confuses power with purpose. Subscribe if you believe karma has a sense of humor. Grab your snacks, because when she lit that flag, she also lit the fuse on a plan that would end with a helicopter, a very shocked Karen, and the greatest property line justice you've ever heard of. Sunday mornings in our neighborhood were usually the definition of peace, the kind of stillness where you can hear sprinklers hissing across lawns and smell bacon from 4 different houses. I had just finished hanging my father's flag on our porch, the one folded in a wooden box for years, carried home from his Navy retirement ceremony. It had been his pride and our family's symbol of everything he stood for. I wanted to fly it again in his honor. My mom was inside making coffee, the morning sunlight catching the faded stripes as if the air itself approved. It should have been a quiet, ordinary moment. But the silence broke with the sharp slam of a screen door and the unmistakable voice of chaos wrapped in perfume and entitlement. Karen. She marched across her lawn like a general on a battlefield, robe tied tight, phone clutched like a weapon, muttering something about neighborhood regulations. I hadn't even turned around before she was already shouting, "That flag is not approved," she yelled from her driveway, and I remember thinking it was too early for whatever drama she was about to start. I smiled, the kind of polite smile you give when you hope someone just needs to vent for a minute. But she wasn't interested in civility. She stormed closer, the clip of her house shoes against the sidewalk getting faster. "This neighborhood has standards," she said, waving a crumpled HOA handbook like a holy text. "We don't allow unsanctioned displays of, well, anything." I told her it wasn't a decoration. It was my dad's flag, the one folded over his uniform at his final salute. Her face twisted like I had just confessed to burying toxic waste under the hydrangeas. "Your personal life doesn't exempt you from community codes," she snapped, jabbing her pen at the pole like it was evidence of a felony. My mom stepped outside then, holding her mug and blinking into the sunlight, confusion written all over her face. She asked if there was a problem, but Karen talked right over her, accusing us of visual disruption and unauthorized memorial installation. The way she said those words made me realize this wasn't about a flag. This was about control. When I told her to calm down, she did something I'll never forget. She pulled out her phone, aimed it at the flag, and started recording like she was documenting a crime scene. "This is for the HOA board," she said, pacing in small circles like a prosecutor rehearsing a speech. "Violations must be enforced." I told her to stop filming. She told me to take the flag down, or she'd report us for defacing community aesthetics. My mom's hand trembled around her coffee mug. That flag had hung over my father's coffin. It wasn't something you just took down because a neighbor didn't like how it clashed with her flower beds. When I refused, Karen's face went cold. She gave this little smirk, the kind that tells you someone's about to cross a line you didn't even know existed. "Fine," she said, tucking her phone under her arm. "If you won't remove it, I will." She left, and for a brief moment, I thought she was bluffing. 10 minutes later, we heard her car door slam. My mom looked through the window and went pale. Karen was back, walking toward our porch with a lighter in one hand and a black trash bag in the other. She didn't yell this time. She didn't need to. She knelt at the pole like she was performing some twisted ritual, flicked the lighter, and pressed the flame to the edge of the flag before I could even move. The fabric curled, blackened, and vanished into smoke. My mother screamed. I ran forward, but by the time I reached her, half of the flag was gone. Karen stood there with this look of smug satisfaction, as if she'd just done something noble. "There," she said. "Problem solved. You're welcome." I stared at the ashes at my feet, too stunned to speak. The smell of burning fabric mixed with the faint scent of morning coffee and gasoline. She turned and walked away while the lighter still glowed in her hand, leaving us in silence broken only by my mom's shaking breath. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Watching my father's flag burn on our lawn, I realized this wasn't about property lines or HOA bylaws. This was about respect, about dignity, about people who believe authority gives them the right to destroy what they don't understand. I didn't yell. I didn't chase her. I just looked down at what was left of that flag and made a quiet promise to my dad's memory. She thought she'd ended a fight before it started, but she had no idea what she had set in motion. Dinner that night was quiet in the way that feels heavy, like the air itself was waiting for someone to break it. The scent of burnt fabric still lingered faintly from the morning, clinging to our clothes and the porch as if the fire hadn't really gone out. My mom sat at the end of the table, staring at her untouched food, her fingers trembling slightly around a glass of water. She wasn't the kind of woman to cry easily, but I could tell she was fighting it. My younger sister scrolled through her phone, trying to find a distraction, but every few seconds she'd glance toward the window, checking if Karen was outside again. The neighborhood looked peaceful from where we sat, yet all of us knew that peace had been broken for good. Ryan came in late, still wearing his flight training uniform, the patches on his shoulders catching the kitchen light. He'd been quiet when he saw the blackened corner of the yard earlier, but now that he'd had time to process it, there was a storm behind his eyes. He sat down, pushed his plate away, and said nothing for a long while. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock above the fridge and the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, he looked at me, his voice calm but edged with something sharper than anger. "She burned Dad's flag," he said quietly, more to confirm it than to ask. I nodded. "In front of us," I added, "and she thinks she was right." Ryan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. "You know, people think I overreact sometimes," he said. "But this isn't overreaction. This is straight-up violation." He looked at Mom, then at me. "We're not letting her get away with that." My mom shook her head, trying to sound composed, but her voice cracked. "I don't want you two doing anything reckless. It's not worth more trouble." But the truth was, even she didn't believe that. She'd spent 20 years beside a man who taught us to stand our ground, to defend what mattered, to respect the flag, because it represented people who gave everything for it. Watching it burn wasn't just property damage, it was desecration of everything our father believed in. That night, after Mom went to bed, Ryan and I sat on the back porch under the dim light of the bug lamp. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, loud and relentless, like the world refused to let us have silence. Ryan had his phone open, scrolling through some documents and aviation forms. "You remember Dad's unit patch?" he asked, eyes still on the screen. I nodded. "Yeah, the blue one, with the wings and anchor." He tapped the screen and turned it toward me. "One of Dad's old buddies flies with the State Air Response Unit. He owes me a favor." I blinked at him, unsure if I understood. "You're not serious." He smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "You think she can burn a flag and walk away?" "No. We're getting it back." We stayed up late sketching ideas and talking through what could be done legally. Ryan wasn't reckless. He was disciplined in a way that made people underestimate how far he could go when he decided on something. By the time the clock hit midnight, we had an outline of what he called Operation Retribution Roof Drop. He wasn't planning anything illegal or dangerous, just poetic. The goal wasn't revenge for revenge's sake. It was about restoration, about showing Karen and everyone else that respect doesn't bow to arrogance. The next morning, Mom found us both asleep at the table, surrounded by coffee cups, scribbled notes, and Ryan's laptop. She stood there for a long time, her expression somewhere between exasperation and pride. "You're really doing this?" she asked. Ryan looked up and nodded. "We're replacing what she destroyed," he said. "But we're doing it the right way." By that afternoon, calls were made. Ryan spoke with a veteran-owned memorial restoration company that agreed to reconstruct the flag using archival fabric and Dad's original service certification. I handled the logistics of permits and airspace authorization, something our father would have loved us for. Mom tried to act disapproving, but when she saw the new flag being sealed in a protective case, her eyes softened. "He'd be proud of you," she said quietly. Across the street, Karen was in her usual spot by her flower beds, sunglasses perched on her head, pretending not to watch us. Every time I caught her eye, she turned away, but her smugness hadn't faded. She had no idea that her moment of triumph was already unraveling. That evening, as the sun set over the rooftops, Ryan stood on the porch holding the newly restored flag. The colors looked deeper somehow, more alive than before. "This isn't about her anymore," he said, staring out toward the lake. "This is about Dad." I watched him fold the flag carefully, the same way Dad used to teach us when we were kids. For the first time since the fire, the air didn't feel heavy. It felt charged, alive with purpose. Karen thought she'd silenced a family's pride, but what she'd really done was give it wings. The morning of the plan felt strangely calm, like the kind of quiet that happens before a summer storm. The sky was a clean, endless blue, the air still and heavy with heat. I stood in the driveway with a cup of coffee, pretending everything was normal, while my heart pounded like it already knew what was coming. Ryan had been up since dawn, running through final checks with the precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. He wasn't wearing his uniform, but his posture carried that same military discipline that made everyone take him seriously. Mom sat on the porch, her hands wrapped around her mug, watching us both with the weary acceptance of someone who understood that certain things just have to be done. We'd spent 2 days making sure everything was legal. Ryan had filed an official request for an aerial demonstration permit through one of his instructors, labeling it as a commemorative veteran tribute. It was technically true. The local aviation authority approved it faster than anyone expected, probably because it sounded patriotic and harmless. We'd even notified the sheriff's department to avoid confusion. By the time everything was signed and sealed, it wasn't just a stunt, it was an event sanctioned by the same kind of bureaucracy Karen worshipped. At around 10, a soft vibration rolled through the air. It was faint at first, the kind of hum that makes dogs tilt their heads, and neighbors start peeking out their windows. The helicopter appeared over the tree line like a slow-moving hawk, its rotors cutting through the quiet suburban air. It wasn't military grade, but it looked close enough to make every curtain in the neighborhood twitch. A banner fluttered beneath it, folded tight for now, marked only with our father's unit insignia. Ryan's friends were in the cockpit, steady and professional, flying at just the right height to draw attention without breaking any rules. Karen was outside before the chopper even reached our property. She wore her usual pastel workout gear and carried that cursed clipboard like it was a badge of office. She marched into the middle of the street, pointing up at the sky and yelling something I couldn't hear over the rising roar. Her hair whipped around her face as the downdraft stirred her carefully maintained garden into chaos. She turned toward me, shouting, "This is an invasion! You can't do this!" I smiled without answering. The neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the noise, cameras in hand, their expressions a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Then, it happened. The helicopter slowed to a hover directly above Karen's house, blades thundering, sunlight glinting off its polished frame. A figure stepped into view from the open side door, strapped into a harness, holding a carefully folded flag. He was one of Dad's old friends, a retired Navy rescue pilot who owed Ryan a favor. His movements were slow, deliberate, filled with the kind of dignity that commands silence. Even Karen stopped yelling for a moment, confusion flickering across her face as she realized what she was witnessing. The pilot descended carefully, guided by a cable, his boots touching down on Karen's perfectly maintained roof. Every neighbor on the street had stopped talking. All you could hear was the rhythmic chop of the blades and the faint rattle of flag clips in the wind. From the ground, I could see him. Attach the flagpole bracket to the corner of her chimney, the same spot where Karen had once hung her ridiculous HOA approved living banner. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone watching. When the cable lifted again, the flag unfurled, catching the sunlight like a burst of color against the pale blue sky. The stars and stripes billowed wide, clean and vivid, a living replacement for what she had destroyed. The helicopter hovered in place, blades roaring over the stunned silence. Then, the pilot saluted from the open doorway, crisp and sharp, the kind of salute that freezes a moment in time. For a heartbeat, everything stopped. Karen's voice cracked through the noise, shrill and desperate. "You can't put that on my property. That's illegal." But nobody moved to help her. Even Officer Jimenez, who had shown up to monitor the permit compliance, just folded his arms and shook his head. "Ma'am," he said, raising his voice over the helicopter, "that's a registered tribute under state authorization. You might want to take a step back." She did not step back. She stood there in her driveway, clutching her clipboard like a shield, shouting about violations and airspace rights while the flag waved triumphantly above her. The neighborhood erupted in applause. Some people laughed, others cried, a few saluted. Karen's words were drowned by the sound of celebration, by the rhythmic pulse of the helicopter fading into the distance as it rose and turned toward the lake. When the noise finally settled, all that remained was the flag, shimmering in the sunlight, its fabric alive with movement. It wasn't just a replacement, it was a statement carved into the sky. Ryan turned to me, his expression calm but satisfied. "Now she knows," he said softly. Mom stood beside him, wiping at her eyes, her voice trembling. He would have loved that. And I knew she was right. Dad would have stood there grinning, proud and quiet, watching that flag rise, again over the one person who tried to erase it. The moment wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembrance. It was about telling the world that some things can't be burned, no matter how hard someone tries. The next morning, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. Every conversation, every passing glance, every social media post within a 10-mile radius was about the helicopter. It was as if our quiet suburban street had become the epicenter of something much larger than any of us. The sound of camera shutters replaced the usual hum of lawnmowers. A local news van parked at the corner before sunrise, its antenna pointed toward the sky like it was waiting for a sequel. Neighbors who had barely spoken to us before were suddenly stopping by with coffee and awkward smiles, pretending they had supported us all along. Even old Mr. Simmons, who hadn't left his house in months, shuffled out to the sidewalk just to stare at the flag glinting in the early light. Karen's blinds stayed closed the entire morning, which only fueled the gossip. Nobody had seen her since the helicopter left, though a few claimed they heard her shouting into her phone late at night. Rumor had it she'd been calling every authority she could think of to report the aerial violation. What she didn't realize was that Ryan had filed every permit, every approval, every necessary clearance, down to the smallest detail. Everything about the event had been above board, meticulously documented. For once, Karen's obsession with rules worked against her, because there was no rule we hadn't already followed. Around noon, a reporter from Channel 7 knocked on our door. She had that practiced smile that news anchors wear when they know they're standing in front of a viral story. She asked if we'd be willing to do an interview. For context, she said. Mom hesitated, still unsure about inviting more attention, but Ryan stepped forward. "Sure," he said. "If it means the truth gets told." They set up their camera in front of the porch, the flag visible behind him, waving gently in the background like it had been waiting for this moment. Ryan spoke quietly but firmly, explaining how the flag had been our father's, how Karen had burned it, how the helicopter drop had been a tribute to everything it represented. There was no anger in his voice, just calm conviction, the kind that makes people listen. When the interview aired that evening, it spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, the story was everywhere. Veterans' family reclaims flag in daring aerial tribute flashed across headlines from local news outlets to national blogs. The footage of the helicopter descending over the houses, the moment the flag unfurled above Karen's roof, the stunned silence of the crowd, every frame was cinematic. People online were calling it the flag that flew back. Comment sections filled with stories from veterans, widows, and families who had lost loved ones, all sharing what the moment meant to them. Meanwhile, Karen's meltdown reached legendary proportions. Someone leaked audio of her phone calls to the local authorities, where she tried to claim the helicopter was an act of aerial aggression. When that didn't work, she filed a noise complaint against the entire event. The city clerk, exhausted from her constant badgering, told her to take it up with the sky. That phrase became the internet's favorite punchline. Memes of Karen pointing at helicopters started appearing everywhere, paired with captions like, "When your HOA handbook can't reach 500 feet. For all the noise and chaos, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood changed. People who had spent years keeping to themselves started talking again. Flags began appearing on porches up and down the street. Each one hung a little higher than the last. There was a sense of unity that hadn't existed before, a quiet understanding that what had happened wasn't just about us. It was about standing up to arrogance with grace, about honoring something bigger than petty rules. On the third evening after the drop, the sun dipped behind the trees, casting gold across the rooftops. Ryan stood out front, hands in his pockets, staring at the flag above Karen's house. It still waved proudly, untouched, the fabric catching the last light like fire. "She hasn't taken it down," he said softly, almost in disbelief. Maybe she finally got the message. I looked across the street and noticed her curtains move slightly, the faint outline of her face watching from behind them. For the first time since this all began, she didn't look angry. She looked defeated. Later that night, I went outside to take out the trash and found something on the porch. A single envelope, no name, no return address. Inside was a short note written in shaky handwriting. "For what it's worth," it said, "I didn't know it meant that much. I'm sorry. I didn't need to see a signature to know who it was from." The apology didn't erase what she'd done, but it was something. Maybe even the first honest thing she'd said since the day she'd moved in. When I told Ryan, he just nodded and said, "That's all we needed." He looked up at the sky, quiet for a moment. "Dad would have laughed at all this," he added, smiling for the first time in days. And maybe he would have. Because, in a strange way, the chaos had brought a kind of peace that no rulebook or regulation ever could. The flag had done what words never could. It reminded everyone what respect really looks like when you refuse to let hate have the last word. A week passed, and the chaos slowly began to fade into something quieter, something almost reverent. The flag still waved from the top of Karen's roof, the colors as vivid as the day it was raised. The morning light caught on it first thing each day, scattering red and white across her beige siding like a silent reminder. It had become the heartbeat of the neighborhood, a symbol that didn't belong to one family anymore, but to everyone who had stood in that street and watched it rise. People still came by to take pictures, but now they did it softly, respectfully, the way you do when you visit a memorial. Karen kept to herself. Her once perfectly groomed yard had gone wild, the grass growing uneven, the flower beds forgotten. The loud bark of her dog, the endless phone calls, the obsessive monitoring from her window, all of it had stopped. Some said she was embarrassed, others said she was planning her next move, but I wasn't sure she had the energy left to fight. The battle she'd tried to start had turned into a story that spread far beyond her control, one that had rewritten her reputation in ways she couldn't undo. The neighborhood Facebook group, once her kingdom, was now filled with posts celebrating the flag, sharing articles, or quoting lines from Ryan's interview. For the first time in years, her name was followed by silence instead of fear. Ryan came home from the flight academy on Friday, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a small grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. He seemed lighter somehow, like the whole thing had burned something out of him but left behind a clearer sense of purpose. He said he had been contacted by a veterans group that wanted to honor Dad at their next memorial event. They'd seen the footage and wanted to feature the story as part of a campaign about community unity. They said it gave people hope, he told us, his voice quiet but proud. Mom smiled in that small, sad way she always did when Dad was mentioned, the kind of smile that carried both love and loss. That night, the three of us sat on the porch, wrapped in the warm glow of the string lights Ryan had hung years ago. The neighborhood had never been this still. You could hear frogs calling from the lake, a soft rhythm beneath the whisper of the flag moving in the wind. Mom broke the silence first, saying she couldn't stop thinking about how everything had changed. "It's strange," she said, staring across the street. "She did something cruel, and yet it brought everyone together." Ryan nodded, tapping his fingers against his glass. "Dad used to say that the measure of a person isn't how they act when they're comfortable, but how they respond when someone disrespects what they love." I thought about that long after they went to bed, about how anger had turned into something else entirely. We hadn't sought revenge, we'd reclaimed dignity. The helicopter wasn't about humiliating Karen. It was about reminding people that certain things, honor, respect, memory, shouldn't be up for debate. The flag was more than cloth. It was every word Dad never got to say, every lesson he'd taught us without realizing it. And now, even though he was gone, it felt like he had spoken louder than ever. A few days later, I saw Karen outside for the first time since her apology note. She was standing at the edge of her driveway, looking up at the flag. Her shoulders were hunched, her eyes shadowed, but she didn't look angry anymore. She looked small, almost fragile, like she had finally seen the truth she'd been running from. For a long moment, she just stood there, then turned and walked back inside without a word. I never saw her try to take it down. Months later, when fall came and the air grew cool again, the flag was still there. The edges had begun to fray slightly, but that only made it more beautiful. It looked weathered, tested, alive. The story had long since left our neighborhood and taken on a life of its own. Veterans wrote to us. Teachers used the footage in lessons about respect, and people sent flags from all over the country asking us to raise them in honor of loved ones. The irony that it all began with one act of hate wasn't lost on anyone. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the world gold, Ryan climbed up to take the flag down for cleaning. When he unfolded it on the porch, I saw how the fabric shimmered in the fading light, glowing like embers that refused to die. He refolded it with the same care Dad once showed him, then placed it back in its glass case above the fireplace. For a long time, we just stood there, the three of us, watching it rest under the glow of the lamp. In that moment, the noise, the anger, the drama, all of it fell away. What remained was quiet pride and the unshakable knowledge that some fires don't destroy, they forge. What Karen had tried to erase had become indestructible. The flag that burned had been reborn, not as a symbol of conflict, but as proof that even the smallest act of courage can outshine the largest act of cruelty. And that, folks, is how a neighborhood tyrant learned that patriotism doesn't need permission slips. If you've ever dealt with a power-tripping Karen who mistook your driveway for her kingdom, smash that subscribe button for more stories where justice takes flight, sometimes literally. Drop a comment with your own Karen versus karma moments, and remember, arrogance might rise fast, but truth always lands smoother. Until next time, keep your flags flying and your neighbors humble.